Francesca Albanese, thanks for being with us. You're an international lawyer and academic, and you were appointed United Nations Special Reporter on the occupied Palestinian territories in 2022 for a 3-year term. Firstly, please first tell us a little bit about your work and the purpose of this mission in general.
Yeah, hi. This mandate, as all special rapporteurs, mandates, or independent experts of the United Nations, is a responsibility that is given to an individual or a group to monitor and document violations of international law on a given domain, right to food, right to water, or a specific country. Iran or Sri Lanka or Central African Republic. And in my case, it's the occupied Palestinian territory. This mandate is one of the oldest of the UN, and it started 30 years ago. And I've been the first woman. I'm the first woman to serve on this position. So what I do, I follow factual developments on the ground, and I do analyze them against international law, and they make recommendations, and I share my views on what's happening.
Obviously, what has happened is that in this past year, Gaza in particular, but all Palestinian territories have seen some of the worst days in decades. So, how would you describe, in your words, the level of urgency on the ground? And have your team and yourself been able to monitor the situation the way you would hope to do?
Yeah, look, independent experts of the United Nations should carry out 2 field visits per year, which in my case and in the case of my predecessors on this mandate has not happened because for 17 years Israel has prevented us from accessing the occupied Palestinian territory. So we have been the first to experience this closure of the Palestinian experience, this isolation of the Palestinians' experience to the outside world and outside witnesses and observers. That now has become the rule because Israel is gradually expelling all UN presences and observers, independent observers from the territory that it occupies illegally. So how I do my job by maintaining regular, almost daily contacts with Palestinians and Israeli organizations, legal associations, lawyers, doctors, UN personnel, journalists. So I have a very widespread network of contacts. And of course, the United Nations are my go-to source for information, which I then corroborate, validate. Once I have collected the facts, the analysis carried out is mine against international law is mine.
And the humanitarian situation has been described repeatedly as a catastrophe by the UN and also most NGOs on the ground, especially doctors from all over the world, including what we now estimate as 42,000 people who died, but maybe thousands more under the rubbles, and 17,000 children made orphans. We've been aware of starvation, insecurity, extreme pollution, no sanitation, and so on. How can the UN tackle such a situation, and what do you want to tell our listeners about the role of the international community?
Look, I think that I've used the word catastrophe for the first time back in October, when Israel had killed like 8,000 or 6,000 people like in the first weeks of the conflict and destroyed entire neighborhoods, bakeries, churches. It targeted UN buildings and universities. So it looked catastrophic to me because this is not the way wars are conducted. Even and again, I had a problem with the framing because you cannot wage a war against the land you occupy, and Israel occupies that land according to the International Court of Justice unlawfully. So Israel occupies unlawfully a territory oppressing its people, who of course retaliate, and resistance is not necessarily a pleasant experience, and then they wage a war against them. It doesn't work that way. So while I've advocated for the investigation and prosecution of the crimes that Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups or individuals had committed against Israeli civilians on October 7, at the same time I've said justice must come in and be delivered. War is not the answer, because it's against international law. And then what has happened has been a further nosediving into this precipice. And of course, catastrophe is now a word that doesn't describe the inferno on earth that Gaza has become, or whose full picture will only be available when the dust settles. And I don't know when it will happen, and if Israel will leave anyone alive. Because look, as we speak, Israel is running extermination raids neighborhood per neighborhood in the areas that was already forcibly evacuated, ethnically cleansed of nearly 1 million people, all in the northern Gaza. Only 400,000 people remained, who have been starved, abused, bombed. What the people in Gaza have gone through is really unspeakable. And now it is emptying the land completely in order to, and they say that the ministers and the military leaders and the religious leaders, that Israel will reoccupy northern Gaza and will settle. So this is, and then they challenge those like myself who claim this is settler colonialism. But if it's in the same words that the Israelis are using, why can't we believe them? Why can't we take the Israelis seriously? And I see that, yeah, in the face of this, Melissa, I see part of the international community completely idle in the face of this monstrosity, mainly Western states, who keep on making up arguments and talking about pontificating about self-defense. And yeah, but Israel has the right to protect itself. Is it protection? How is what Israel is doing going to make its citizens protected ever after this? This is the question. And the blindness at the political level is mind-blowing.
Can we reflect on the role of the UN recently with Israel's further attacks in southern Lebanon, but also in the West Bank? A lot of UN workers have been targeted, and this is also supposed to be investigated later on. Do you feel that the UN is not supported enough, or are the institution letting you down because of the nature of the multiple crises?
Okay, so I think that the United Nations have reached a breaking point, and so the international legal system, which has proven so ineffective to protect the most basic instances and needs in life in Gaza, that people around the world are really wondering, what is international law for? And while I think that international law is a neutral instrument, I mean, it's pretty blind, it doesn't have a direction, it doesn't know where it's going. Justice is to see where it's going. And law cannot be an instrument of politics and not a tool to deliver justice. In 75 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was the promise of a different world, of a world not dominated by the rule of force, but of the force of the law. All this has been really eroded or severely damaged. We have a country which is advancing an expansionist agenda at the expense of a native population which is being forcibly displaced, arbitrarily arrested, extrajudicially killed. And it has been so for decades, and now starved and genocided. And the system doesn't work. It fails its humanitarian operations and mission. It fails its political mission to preserve peace and security, and it fails its function to apply justice when violations of international law have occurred. Well, how do we get past this? I think that this system will be sorely missed when it will no longer be there, and there is a revival or a resurge of extremely right-wing and worrisome forces around the world. So I encourage us, all of us, to be more active and responsible, to force policymakers to abide by international law. So to use the system as is, as well as it can get. And because it is not going to get reformed right now, but what we have needs to be acted upon. And it's not given that we will succeed, but it's not lost yet. And this is why it's worth continuing.
Mm-hmm. Also, in the global south, countries like South Africa, Nicaragua, Turkey have tried to involve the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. Do you have hope that these cases can move forward? It would kind of be a first that a country that is not a southern country would be prosecuted. And is this also a solution? Because on the ground, people are dying on an hourly basis. So time between justice and humanitarian aid is conflicted.
Look, there is such a schism between the reality on the ground and the response that is given at the international level, which is so frustrating, because it seems that people don't see or don't value the life and death of the Palestinians. I mean, there are at least 17,000 Palestinian children who have been butchered. Do you imagine had this been Israeli children? Of course, I don't wish that. Of course not. For me, the life of an Israeli child is equal to the life of a Palestinian child. And I will tell you more, is equal to the life of my own children. This is what humanity is for me. But at the same time, I see that the international community reacts to the suffering of the Israelis in such an extreme way compared to the ordinary suffering of the Palestinians who have endured a painful fate for decades. And for me, this as one is simply selective outrage, double standards and morality, and eventually racism. So how to fix it? First of all, understanding what we are confronted with and dealing with our own this germ inside of us, which is a dormant gene of racism. And I'm talking as a European, we need to deal with this bias toward the others, toward people in the global south. And if this happens, there won't be hindrances to an effective litigation of the first settler colonial genocide in modern history to be brought on a court's bench.
It also seems that diplomatically, one of the key issues is that Israel's main ally is the United States. Are you thinking that we all need to wait until the result of the US election until any form of policy change can come about? France and Spain and Ireland have called somehow differently, but a little bit, to reevaluate their contract for sending arms to Israel. But again, the key country seems to be the United States. In regards to what you just said, it represents still the same old imbalance in world policies. But do you expect that maybe after early November we might have a different conversation on the future of Palestinian civilians?
No, Melissa, I don't think that a new president, considering who's running for elections, will make a dramatic change for the US foreign policy. I think I've always, as a European, I've always found very strange that there are like corporations or corporate interests dominating and influencing the electoral process so much, even more than the will of the people themselves. And I'm shocked that there is even a boasting about an organization like APAC bragging about them shifting the electoral outcome, or being able to influence the electoral outcome, pushing out of the system anyone who's vaguely critical of Israel, and pumping up everyone who's an adorer of Israel. And it seems incredible to me, because apart from the hubris and the violence of such a system, so that puts some states above the law, as if it was the Middle Age, with a feudal system where the lords were above the ordinary people, and the king was not considered to be under the law. Are we still there? But in an era where we have made such an investment on human rights, saying that human rights are the foundation of our system and they are there to protect us, therefore needs to be respected, freedom of association, freedom of expression in particular. The US is the first betrayal of these fundamental rights, both at the constitutional and domestic level and internationally. The United States is the first and foremost country which doesn't respect international law. And when it comes in its in the establishment of its international relations, because I don't think that there is one country which doesn't violate international law. And at the same time, the US has pursued a shock doctrine policy, as Naomi Klein says, and a very aggressive expansionistic policy vis-a-vis other areas of the world, from Latin America to Asia to the Middle East. And this system, looked at from outside, looks more like a club, like a settler colonial club or a bloc, than a community made of universal values and guarantees. The US is a country birthed from a genocide, which is not even fully acknowledged. It's a country which has practiced de facto racial segregation and apartheid toward its citizens, the African American minority, who had been taken there as slaves. So don't you think that this should require a bit of atonement before going and preaching about democracy and democratic values to other countries?
Before we wrap up, a lot of organizations have called for a year now for a ceasefire, which sounds like the only ways to bring humanitarian aid properly. Do you have faith that this would be possible, even maybe before the end of the year? And if not, how can we help Palestinians in northern Gaza and Gaza in general?
It must be feasible. It must be feasible, because we are not talking of a ceasefire to put an end of hostilities. There is no hostilities. Israel is slaughtering civilians. People need to understand this, because I'm seeing images every day, and I'm studying them, validating them with experts, forensic experts and others on the ground. And Israel is literally slaughtering civilians, refugee camp after refugee camp, neighborhoods after neighborhoods, shelter after shelters, hospital after hospitals, in order to push them out of northern Gaza. And once this will be done, it will continue with the south. The three leaders of Hamas, the political leader Haniyeh, and the head of the military component, Yahya Sinwar, and Mohammed Deif, three wanted by the International Criminal Court, have been killed. 42,000 people have been killed by bombs and snipers. What else is needed? And now the Israelis say that the war has just begun. To see what Israel is doing. How can we be so blind?
Well, thank you very much, Francesca Albanese.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and all the best.